I will move into my library, but if the contact is poor, you tell me and I go back here.
Okay, you're moving. No, that's no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We are super happy to welcome you from ReThink.
If the contact is poor, you tell me and I go back here.
Okay, you're moving. No, that's no problem. Sorry for that. Okay, good morning. It's doubling from the YouTube, I guess. Well, again, good morning, everyone. We are happy to welcome you from our headquarters here in Kiev. A bit empty, but still, we're pleased that you are willing to join such an early time to the discussion of circular economy future after the COVID-19, and we are extremely happy to welcome our outstanding speaker today, Anders Wijkman from Stockholm, from Sweden. And normally I would say I give the floor to Mr. Anders, but in this case I give the screen to Mr. Anders, and we hope for a very informative and valuable discussion today. We will have in total 1 hour, so Mr. Wijkman will speak for about 30 minutes or 40 minutes, and then we will have some room for questions. So we hope to be strict within 1 hour schedule. Well, then Mr. Anders, the screen and floor is yours, please.
Well, thanks a lot, and thank you for this invitation. It's nice to be back in Kiev, although I'm not there in person, only online, but I have very fond memories of Ukraine, and in particular of your capital a few years ago. My theme of today is, of course, quite broad, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background and then trying to zoom in on what to do in relation to material efficiency and the circular economy. But since we are in a crisis, let me start by quoting Winston Churchill, and I think the same quote was used by Obama during the financial crisis. And Churchill said sometimes during the war, Second World War, or immediately after, never waste a good crisis. And what he meant by that is, of course, that a crisis, like in the Chinese language, constitutes both a problem and an opportunity. And the opportunity is really to rethink what you're doing and to start developing on a new path, so to say. And if we look back into history, what has happened after major crisis, we can take a look at the First World War, where the peace agreement was, in many people's views, a disaster, leading eventually to the Second World War. So the First World War is not a good example. Second World War, much better. After 5-6 years of enormous destruction, the world community came together. We established the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. We had a Marshall Plan from the US that helped rebuild Europe after all the destruction. So that was a crisis well spent, you could say. Then we had the tsunami in 2004, this big disaster in parts of Asia. I do recall that former president of the US, Bill Clinton, was put in charge of reconstruction, and he coined the term already at that time, build back better. And the idea was to build more resilient societies, reduce disaster risks, etc. I haven't done any evaluation, so I don't know to what extent that happened, but at least that was the objective. The financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 was not a good example of using a crisis for the benefit. Of course, there were some changes in the regulation of financial markets, but most of them were taken away, at least in the US context, by Trump when he became president. although during the election campaign, he was giving the impression that he would be tough on Wall Street, but on the contrary, he has been very soft on Wall Street. And now the question is, what happens after COVID-19? Well, we are in the middle of this pandemic, so, but we are also discussing in many parts of the world how the recovery should take place. Now, when we start such a discussion, we should recall that we are confronted by a number of challenges in this world of today. The global economy has led to a lot of risks, you could say. And on top of it, we have a market economic system, which in my opinion is plundering the planet. The economic model is very poor when it comes to really taking care of or managing in a way that we don't destroy ecosystems and that we don't pollute the atmosphere. So we are confronted both by climate change, vital ecosystems are on the decline, and we lose a lot of biodiversity every year. Parallel to that, we have a lot of inequality on the rise. On the one hand, poverty has been reduced, not least in China. But when we look at the world today, we can see that a small group of people at the top of the income ladder, they benefit a lot from this system, whereas most people are lagging behind. So you have widening gaps in societies. And that in a way also affects the trust level in society. So we have a problem there. A new financial crisis is looming. Companies, households, and governments all over the world are very much indebted. The total global debt before this crisis was 320% of global GDP, which is a terrifying sort of level. Add to that the crisis of politics, where we've seen a lot of attempts to manipulate elections recently. And we have this whole debate about fake news, what is truth, what is not. So I think that we are in the midst of a number of challenges. And now that we are going to recover from the crisis, we should, of course, try to make sure that we don't just build back the same kind of society, rather build back something better. And before COVID, we had a lot of plans for what we could call transformation being discussed. And the notion was that globalization had gone too far. We had this English author, I don't know if you've read his book, but he wrote a very interesting book. His name is Goodhart, where he talked about the anywheres and the somewheres. The anywheres are people like me, who are quite well educated, who speak languages, who can take on jobs almost anywhere in the world, and who benefit from this global system. And then you have all the somewheres, people who are not so well educated, who are dependent on jobs locally, and some of those jobs have disappeared. So you have an increasing tension between the anywheres and the somewheres. And many people say that that led to the result both in the US election and the UK election on Brexit. That people were pissed off or very upset about how things were developing. And they really protested against the elites and wanted something different. Now, the different that they got is probably not better, but at least it was a demonstration that things were not moving well. We were talking about the climate emergency over the last 12 months, and we were focusing a lot on energy transition, moving out of fossil fuels and into other energy sources. We were even talking about the planetary emergency, the Club of Rome, where I'm very active. Together with the Potsdam Institute, the WWF, we presented something called a planetary emergency plan, where we tried to integrate or merge the agenda of climate change and biodiversity loss. There was a lot of talk about the Green Deal, both in the US and in the EU. The new Commission, European Commission, had its sort of major brand when it came into office, this Green Deal. We were talking about debts building up. We were also talking about exponential technologies, in particular AI, how to steer it for the benefit of society. And there was a lot of debate about democracy at risk. So the potential for a sound recovery after COVID-19 should be pretty good, because we have had all these discussions about transformation, and there are very strong demands for build back better. But there are, of course, also strong demands for support of business as usual. All the car manufacturers, the airlines, steel industries, oil and gas companies who now suffer from low demand, they call on governments to support them and just go back to sort of normal. So there is a tension here, and we can see that in the European Union. They were supposed to present their recovery plan on May the 6th. It's being delayed week after week. Now I believe it's going to be presented next week on the 27th, but we still don't know how much Build Back Better will be there. There is a lot of money spent all over the world, and I think it would be really a missed opportunity if not major social and ecological concerns are being addressed. And if we can spend trillions of dollars on COVID-19, why not spend something of the same on the other challenges, which may be a bit more long-term, but which may hit us very, very hard. So in this talk, I will focus on the climate and environment challenges, because if I was going to cover everything, we would spend all day today. And let me just give a little bit of background. I think it's important to realize that we come to this discussion from being a small population on a very large planet. I mean, when I was at school, we were less than 3 billion people on this planet. Now we are almost 8 billion. So we have gone from being a small population on a large planet to a large population on a small planet. And the irony is that economists, they seem to think that we can have the same economic model regardless of how many people we are and how large the economy is. And since we have only this small planet and it's finite, I mean, common sense tells me that this is rather a stupid view. Here you can see on this slide all the curves in terms of increased demand for resources of different kinds and increased pressure on various types of ecosystems, including greenhouse gas emissions. And we have a lot of evidence that the environment is under enormous pressure. Climate change and greenhouse gas emissions is probably the most visible thing, but we shouldn't underestimate the problem with the ecosystems being degraded or used unsustainably. Whether we look at soils, forests, biodiversity, oceans, we have a lot of challenges. For instance, 1/3 of the soils are moderately or highly degraded due to erosion. And in the longer term perspective, that is going, of course, to affect our food production very, very negatively. This picture is meant to show the relationship between us humans and the rest of the creation, or the rest of the species. It's the aggregate body weight of mammals living on land. So it's us humans, it's our pets and livestock, and it's the wild animals. And we talk about vertebrates living on land. The dark gray, that's us humans. The light gray, that's all our pets and livestock. And the greens are wild animals. And you can see that the wild animals are being marginalized more and more and more. They only represent 3% of this aggregate body weight. If we had done this picture say 50 or 100 years ago, it would of course have looked totally different. The Greens would have, if not dominated, at least been maybe 30–40%. So this just shows that humans, we have marginalized habitats and species to an extent that is of course very, very scary. One example of this was a report last year that the number of insects is plummeting in different parts of the world. I can personally experience it. I remember when I used to drive my car during the summer months, some 20–30 years ago, I had to stop every 100 kilometers to wash the window because it was full of insects. Now there are very few insects. So there is something happening. And the insects are important not only for pollination, but they are also very important as in the food chain. What will become of the birds, the reptiles, the amphibians, etc., if there are no insects? So that's just one illustration that ecosystems are badly affected by us humans and our activities. Well, then we have the problem with the plastics. I don't go into detail. We know that it's affecting in particular the oceans and all the animals in and around the oceans. And then we have carbon emissions following very nicely growth of GDP, as you can see over time. So there is a very strong link between energy use and the production of goods and services. And we have all those examples of effects already, consequences of climate change. Now, this kind of narrative is of course very negative. Of course, we should balance it a bit with the fact that some things have become much better. Hans Rosling, who unfortunately died a few years ago, his book Factfulness deals with many of these problems. He was a close friend of mine, and he showed that when it comes to the number of poverty, the number of people in poverty, in extreme poverty, had gone down significantly over the last 50 years. Number of child deaths had also gone down significantly. Certain diseases like measles had also gone down. We had the vaccination against most of it. Babies per woman, apart from Africa, have gone down. So we are roughly around 2 children per woman in most of the world. In Africa, we still are something around 5, which means that the population is still increasing very, very rapidly. I already talked about inequalities, and here is the UN projections over population in the coming years and decades. We are about here now. Here we are, 7.6 or 7.7 billion. I think the most likely curve is this one, the yellow one. So we would be at least 10 billion, maybe 11 billion at the end of the century. And my sort of conclusion is that the kind of growth policies that we have entertained over the last 100 years, measured by GDP growth, was working very well in what I call the empty world, when we were relatively few people and the economy was not so big. Now we live in what I would call a full world, and then the situation is so much different. And I think we have to rethink economics to a large extent and make sure that the economic system, the main entry point for the economic system is how nature works, and make sure that we don't sort of violate those principles, rather try to align ourselves with the way nature works. Here we have a lot of slides showing the negative consequences of climate change, the terrible fires in California or in Australia. We have an increased number of very strong cyclones and heavy storms. In some parts of the world, we have sinkholes. Jakarta is an example where the combination of sea level rise and already fragile grounds make enormous problems for the future. We have the shrinking of the Arctic ice. We have Greenland that is melting much faster. That will eventually also lead to sea level rise. And we have the risk for permafrost degradation, that the permafrost is starting to melt in Siberia and other parts of around the Arctic, meaning that a lot of CO2 and methane will be released. And then we have the scary thing, namely tipping points, namely that the climate system is not linear, it's non-linear, and there are tipping points out there where things start to change dramatically, like reduction of ice and glaciers, which will reduce the albedo effect and accelerate warming, or the melting of the tundras, which may lead to a lot of release of CO2 and methane, and then also accelerate warming. So that's why the IPCC came out with its 1.5 degree report a little bit more than a year ago, where they tried to compare the consequences of warming around 1.5 and warming around 2 degrees, and came to the conclusion that to be on the safe side, humanity should try to stay within 1.5. And to do that, the so-called global carbon law was introduced, implying that we would have to halve emissions globally every decade until 2050. And it's a tall order, you know, it means 7 to 8% reduction year after year after year. And no country has done more than a couple of percentages, 2% of reduction over the last 50 years. So this is really a tall order. And based on my experience in the European Union, I would say that there is a big difference between what I call incrementalism, when you cut emissions by a few percentages every year, and when you are asked to really reduce emissions and come down to zero in 25, 30 years' time. Incrementalism you can do within the present structure and the present economic system. That's quite easy. In Sweden, we have reduced emissions by 25% since 1990. We've been able to do that within the present economic structure. But if you are in for transformation, you have to fundamentally rethink how you do things in almost every sector of the society. Energy, infrastructure, basic materials, agriculture, textiles, electronics. And what is important with regard to the circular economy is, of course, that basic materials make up almost 20% of carbon emissions in their use today. We also know that a lot of materials are being used when cities are being planned and built. And because of all the migration to cities in different parts of the world and population increase, the calculation tells us that we have only built about half of the urban infrastructure that we will need in 2050 so far. And urban infrastructure requires cement, it requires steel, aluminium, plastics, etc. And just to illustrate what this means, in 3 years between 2011 and 2013, China used more cement than the US did during the 20th century. And the reason was, of course, that China built a lot of million-size kind of cities. I'm a member of something called the International Resource Panel. It's a UN body with a lot of experts on material use. We published a report that you can find on the United Nations Environment Programme website called GROW 2019. And our estimate was that 50% of global carbon emissions and 80% of biodiversity loss are directly related to the extraction and production of materials. So you can see that to focus on materials, not only energy systems, is highly motivated. Here you see a graph that shows how the demand for different types of materials. You have biomass, you have fossil fuels, you have metals, you have non-metallic minerals is increasing over time. The black dotted line here is economic growth. And we have been talking about decoupling economic growth from material use for quite some time. And there was a little bit of decoupling, at least relatively speaking, between 1990 and 2005. But after that, and in particular because of the enormous expansion of urban infrastructure in countries like China and India, we now have a situation where material demand is actually growing faster than economic growth. And of course, this is very ominous. And the problem is that we have almost linear production systems all over the economy. And if we look at Europe, on average, we only use materials once. So we extract raw materials from the ground, we turn them into products in manufacturing, and we use those products for a limited period of time, and then we throw them away. And they are designed in a way that it's very difficult to reuse and recycle. Here you can see how the expectation is from where we are today, how demand for aluminium and cement, and here is for steel and plastics, will go in the years to come. And if we use today's technologies to produce that steel, that aluminium, that cement, and those plastics, we can forget about the Paris Agreement on climate change, because only the extraction of these materials will eat up the carbon budget that we have. So this speaks in favor then for a totally different way of using materials. You may ask yourself, why do we have this very wasteful production system? Well, it is wasteful simply because the design is such that most of the things that we use cannot be effectively recycled and reused. My mobile phone is a perfect example. Things are glued together in a way that it's very difficult to dismantle and make use of the components for a new telephone. In fact, up till recently, the only things that were retrieved here was gold and copper. And we did a study in Sweden where I was chairing the Recycling Industry Association. And we looked at steel, we looked at plastics, aluminium, cement, and paper. And we tried to understand, if we put a certain amount of money of plastics or steel into the market, how much of that value is still retrieved or captured after first use of a product. And we came to the conclusion that on average only 25% of the materials were still, the value was maintained. For plastics it was 8%, meaning that almost all of the plastic was gone, either into the oceans or dumped somewhere or incinerated. Steel was a bit better, 55%. Aluminium, I thought, would be very effectively recycled and reused because it's quite expensive. And the beer cans and Coca-Cola cans, they are well recycled and reused. But for most other materials where aluminium is used, you are talking about composite materials where the design is such that it's very, very difficult to retrieve the aluminium at the end of a product life. So this results in a lot of money just thrown away. And of course, the result is also a lot of pollution because you need to extract new materials from the crust of the earth. We also have a system where what we have produced is quite badly utilized. If you look at the mobility system, for instance, a private car stands idle about 95% of the time. In the built environment, office space, we did a study in Stockholm, only 11% of the offices are occupied all the time. People are always on the move, and now after COVID-19, I think more and more people will work at home, so we will need much less office space. So that's another example of a lot of materials being used and not effectively utilized. Food system is the same. We throw away. There is it's enormous waste in the food system. In industrial countries, it's primarily in the consumer at the consumer end. In many developing countries, it's at the production end because they don't have storage and storage facilities, so things rotten before they get to the market. But all in all, we produce a lot of food that is not really used, just wasted. And this is why we moved into this discussion about a circular economy, going from linear systems to circular systems, both in the technosphere and in the biosphere. As you know, circular economy has no good, precise definition. It's more of a metaphor for, on the one hand, renewables and resource efficiency. And it implies to extend product life. That is to say, don't build obsolescence into, for instance, computers, light bulbs, or electric motors. This is a very important thing because we have a lot of obsolescence today, meaning that things start to, they stop to work after a certain period of time. Then, of course, we talk about recycle, reuse, remanufacture, repair, maintenance. But I would submit that recycling, even if it's positive, it's the least effective of the one. It's much better if you can reuse a material without having to melt it down and start again, or remanufacture, you know, take in an engine and see what you can do and sell it again. Repair and maintain. Those are crucial issues in the context of circularity. Another very important sort of angle is to move from selling stuff to offering services. Why do I have to own my mobile phone? This means that when, in this case, Apple has sold the mobile phone to me, it's none of their business any longer. They have no interest in what happens after I have used it. And it's not designed so that it can be reused and recycled. If instead, in this case, Apple owned my telephone and I was leasing it, it would be a different business model, and it would be in their interest to design it in a way that the material that is still quite valuable after I have used it could be used again. Another dimension of circularity is also to utilize better what is already produced. I referred to office space, I referred to mobility, I referred to food. And yet another is the sharing economy, which also is part of this circularity dimension. You could ask yourself, why do we still have these linear material flows? I would say the main reason is that it's so cheap to use nature. We don't pay for the externalities. Labor, on the other hand, in particular in industrial countries, is expensive. So you save on labor and you use materials instead in excess. And we have developed business models that favor high throughput and products that do not last long. So here are some, I would say, shortcomings in the economic system. Some of this made sense when we were a small population on a big planet, because then resources looked enormously abundant. But now we are in a different situation, not least with regard to pollution. Well, then you ask yourself, what are the policy interventions to consider? Well, I think, first of all, we have to make sure we create the market for secondary materials. And that means, in my opinion, we should lower taxes on labor and we should higher taxes on the use of nature. In my country, Sweden, 60% of tax revenue is on taxing labor. 25% is VAT. 9% is taxes on companies and property and finance. And only 5.5% is taxes on energy, resource use, and pollution. It's a very, very strange distribution. So here, of course, a tax reform would do wonders. Secondly, we have to extend product life. And I think we should have sort of a product, some kind of legislation guiding how products should be designed. They should be designed for reuse and recycling. That is to say, they should be easy to use again. And they should also be designed so you extend product life. So there is no obsolescence built into them. Then, of course, we should promote by various means both reduce, reuse, refurbish, maintenance, and remanufacturing. And again, taxation plays a role. In Sweden, there was a decision a couple of years ago to reduce VAT on repair and maintenance. And that has already had some effect, not a major effect, but some effect. Because before that, when you went into a shop and you had a problem with your television set or your radio or your computer, and you say, can you please fix it? They looked at you and they said, well, it's going to cost you maybe $150. It's better that you buy a new one. That is to say, throw away, buy new. So here you have to look at cost differentials and the cost structure. Then, of course, this idea about turning products into services is very attractive. I have a friend in the Switzerland, Walter Stahel. He's written a fascinating book about it, the performance economy, that deals with exactly this. And in most areas of the economy, you can in fact do it, and it is already happening. Then, of course, we have to make material efficiency a priority in climate policy. We have focused a lot on energy and energy use, but material use is as important. We should also use the public sector or public procurement more proactively. Public procurement in my country makes up 20% of the economy. And if government agencies and municipalities and regions buy their stuff in a more intelligent way, they can help move the market in the right direction. I've also put here deal with the rebound effects. I don't have time to go into it, but rebound means that if you make a system more efficient, in this case, resource efficiency or material efficiency, you free up money and you tend to use that money to demand more material somewhere else in the economy. A good example is you buy a car that is not so much a gas guzzler. It reduces the consumption of gasoline, meaning that you can drive longer distances. So these rebound effects are for real and have to be dealt with. The EU Green Deal includes most of the necessary measures to promote the circular economy. In the previous 5 years, the circular economy in the EU context was very much focusing downstream on waste management. Now it's focusing upstream on design and the cost structure of the economy. So I think there is a good opportunity now to do something real and start moving the economy in this direction. Of course, it's not going to be easy because we live in a global economy. We have a lot of global value change. Some of the stuff is extracted maybe in Asia and then moving to Turkey, turned into something, and then moving on to the UK or the US. So you have very complex supply chains. But if in the EU, with such a big market, we would start calling for more circularity and putting in place legislation that makes it mandatory, I think it will. I think it could happen. And I have very high hopes that next week, when the recovery deal is being launched, recovery plan, that the circularity aspect is going to be prominent. I also think people realize that a circular economy means not only lower emissions and saving money, it also means more jobs. We did a study in the Club of Rome a few years ago. We looked at altogether 7 economies in Europe. and we asked ourselves, if we move towards more energy and material efficiency, what would the effects over a 10-year period be on carbon emissions and on jobs? And carbon emissions would go down significantly, in our case by 65%. And all of these economies would generate more jobs, because an economy where you care for what you produced, which is more about services than just selling products, which is more about repair and maintenance, refurbishment, is also more labor intensive. And one of the examples is going to be retrofitting of buildings, for instance. That's going to lead to a lot of new jobs. And most of the buildings in the European Union are not very energy efficient. On the contrary. So there are strong arguments in favor of moving in this direction, also from a purely employment perspective. Here is a graph of taxation in Europe. As you can see, tax on labor is very high, and here are the taxes on nature very low. Finally, let me just walk you through, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe we should stop now. I walk through this. These are some 10 action points from the Club of Rome on a climate emergency. Let me end by saying I think we face a moral crisis. We are using materials, both energy and materials, in a way as if there was no tomorrow. We cannot continue like this. We need to be more intelligent. We need to understand that on a planet with 8, soon to be 10 billion people, we need another logic. And we cannot have a logic of Mr. Friedman, where he said that the sole purpose of a business is to make more money for its shareholders, because that has led us to the situation where we are. We need a more responsible business sector. And this is Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever. You have to contribute to society. You have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of the company? It's not only shareholder value, it's also stakeholder value. And stakeholders are many. And we have to go from a very materialistic, mechanical view till a more ecosystem-based or living system-based view of the world. This is where we are today. This is where we need to go. We have to build an economy that is regenerative. And that means a better balance between man and nature, between heart and brain, between the short term and the long term. That's very important. Between state and markets, between men and women, between religion and state, speed and stability, and equity and rewards for excellence. The last point is about shareholders versus wages. So I think I will end by quoting another thinker that has inspired me a lot, Gregory Bateson. He said, the major problems of the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. And I think that's very well put. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will now
Thank you.
take away that one. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Anders, very much. And we have so many questions actually arriving from everywhere. I think there are over 50 questions. And we made a deal that some of them, of course, most of them, that we will not be able to answer during the session. Mr. Wijkman.
I see a few of them here. I see that Luigi Baumann, Albania, said, Factfulness is the best book I ever read. I have my reservations, because I think that with all due respect to Hans Rosling, he didn't really cover nature. He was not concerned about soils, about water, about biodiversity. He was concerned about climate change, but the rest of nature was not really something he was concerned about. And that's a major weakness or shortcoming of that book. That's why we have to complement Factfulness with books that really cover the rest. And the book I wrote with Ernst von Weizsäcker a few years ago, that has been translated into Ukraine, called Come On in English, is doing exactly this. So that was just a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've selected several, as for me, interesting questions. For example, how can banks, fintechs, and financial sector as a whole contribute into circular economy in these new conditions?
Well, you know, the main problem, I think, is that investments that would lead to a more sustainable society will give you a nice return over the long term in terms of rate of return on your investment. But the financial sector is very much focusing on 20 to 25% return now, short term. And that's why the whole system is like a casino. And that's why there is so much money spent on things that are not resilient, that are very risky. Just ask banks and financial institutions how much they are exposed in their lending portfolio to climate risks or ecosystem risks. Many of them don't know about it even. So we need on the one hand to understand back the risk exposure. So you have to have, I think, a mandatory reporting system where banks and financial institutions should be able to tell about the risk they take. Secondly, we should stop investments in things that destroy the planet. It cannot happen from one day to the other. I mean, we are to 80% dependent on fossil fuels, so we have to do it step by step. But we have to start now. I think we have to mobilize a lot of what I call patient capital, pension funds and others who are interested in a stable return on investments over time. We have to engage them very much in the sustainable investment sort of agenda.
Yes, I agree with that. Thank you. Another one, what are your opinions on Norway plans for the well-being of the environment?
Once more, what are you?
What's your opinion on Norway, your neighbor, Norway's plans for well-being of the environment?
Well, I haven't studied Norway recently in detail. I mean, the problem for Norway is, of course, that they have acquired their welfare and well-being and probably the highest standard of living in the world if you look at distribution, primarily on selling oil and gas. And they now realize they cannot continue doing that, at least not for the long term. So this is a problem for Norway. More than 50% of the Norwegian stock exchange is very much dependent on oil and gas. And of course, that's not sustainable. So Norway has a huge challenge. They are very active internationally in trying to help, in particular, developing countries reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. And they also are very proactive in forest protection, reforestation, etc. So that's good. But I think still Norway has a major lesson to. They have a lot of homework to do until they can present a long-term plan for sustainability.
All right, thank you. I don't know whether this question comes from Ukraine because it really sounds like that, but maybe it is also applicable to another country. But when our government prioritizes profit through consumerism, how do we then achieve a circular economy? So it's about consumerism and how people behave right now.
Well, you know, consumerism can take on many forms. And I don't think that consumers alone can change the system. But of course, if consumers start paying more attention to what is sustainable than the opposite, that sends a very strong signal to companies. So that consumer behavior is very important. But the structure of the economy and the incentives in the economy and the cost to use nature versus to use secondary materials is very, very important. So if the government really wants to promote circularity in all its aspects, it needs to think very carefully what incentives there are. And I think the most important thing is to look at the taxation system. Stop taxing labor so much and introduce taxes on the use of nature, because then the secondary materials market will start to boom by itself, because then it will make sense to use secondary materials. Today, in many areas, it doesn't.
Indeed. Then also a few questions on Eastern Europe. I can unite them into one, because people ask what's the main problem to develop circular economy more quickly, for example, in Ukraine, but also in the world. And also another question is in Poland. What's your view for Poland for the next decade? And there, I think a person is considering also political agenda, closing in relationships with the US and even in defense and other all kinds of nuclear weapons topic, etc.
I would rather not enter into the nuclear stuff, because that would require an hour of talk. It's so complicated.
I can imagine. We have only 3 minutes left.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. But you know, I think what's going to be important for Poland and also for Ukraine is what now happens in the European Union, because if the European Union, a market of more than 500 million people, starts taking the circular economy as a concept more seriously, it will also mean Poland is part of the European Union, so they will be directly affected, but indirectly Ukraine will also be affected, because if Ukraine wants to share their products and services with the European markets, they need to conform with the requirements at the European market. But you know, individual governments can do a lot, and again, by looking at taxation, looking at design, and also being clear about that if they are true to the Paris Agreement and they really want to reduce carbon emissions, they need to look at materials and how we use materials. Otherwise, it's not going to work, because materials take up such a large portion of carbon emissions. So there are so many entry points. You could also say that we saw when we did this study in Sweden about how much material value was still there after first use of a product. We threw away a lot of money. Our estimate was that we threw away between 2 and 3% of GDP every year by just being stupid and wasteful. So there is so much to be gained by analyzing this carefully. The paper I did for OECD, which is on the OECD website, looks at this more in detail, and it recognizes a lot of good examples all over Europe, in particular in cities, where they try to reduce material flows and use materials more efficiently. The problem is that it's a very fragmented picture, so you need a more systemic approach. I'm very actively involved in something called Climate Kick, which is an innovation program at the European level, and we are trying to help cities and regions to move in this direction, to take a more systemic approach, because everything is interlinked. And that's another problem we have with sustainability, that we are very good at analyzing pieces, but we are not so good at analyzing the whole, and everything is interconnected. So we need a more integrated approach.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Wijkman. It's 11 o'clock, so the time is up actually. The rest of questions we will try to answer in written form.
I'm sorry we didn't have more time. I'm ready to stay on, but it's your call.
Okay, then we will ask one more question, which I find quite interesting, about the localization and local level. Which opportunities do you think related to circular economy we should not miss on local level?
Once again, I didn't hear.
Which opportunities related to circular economy we should not miss on the local level?
Oh, you could look at mobility, which is very important. You could look at the use of buildings and building materials. Construction uses around 40% of all the materials in society, so the throughput there is very, very large. And if you build and construct in a way with a mindset that thinks about what happens once the building is going to be renovated or is going to be torn down, you have made a huge difference between what is the situation today. So the building and construction sector, in my view, is probably the most important one. Electronics is also very important. There you have not so good opportunities because most of the electronics is produced somewhere else, probably in China or in the US. But how it's being sold and advertised and how it's being used after the first person used it is very important. Well, those were a few examples.
Do you think that Ukraine could become the European China in all this future world? I mean, manufacturing and use of relatively cheap but high quality labor.
Yes, I think so. And you know, the beauty of circularity is that it will eventually do away with some of these global value chains, because it doesn't make sense to send materials back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I think circularity in effect means regionalization, and to some extent also localization. So yes, I think the prospects are good for that to happen. But it will not happen by itself. You need the political system to do this. Because if circularity would happen by itself, the market would have fixed it. But the market hasn't fixed it, simply because the cost structure and the product requirements are not the right ones. I have this dream that you would have a product requirement at the European Union level, which basically said that any product that is sold and marketed in the European Union, product or service, should be done in a way that materials and components can be easily reused and recycled. Just imagine that was a general product requirement. Things would look very, very different. And you know, I've talked to a lot of design specialists, people very much preoccupied by design, and they are fascinated by this this challenge, because they said nobody asked us for this in the past. In the past, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, we were asked to do, you know, luxury products. We were asked to do things that looked smart, and we were never asked to design things that would last longer, that would be easy to reuse and recycle. So it's a question of a mindset. And again, democracy must put this in place through the political system.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Anders, for this inspiring.
I would like to add one thing. Of course, what we haven't touched upon, and that is an important issue in relation to the question on consumerism, is of course what is sufficient. There is a beautiful word in the English language, sufficiency, and I think that should be more in the focus when we discuss consumerism in the future. We have too many examples of wasteful lifestyles. That, in a way, means we are eating into the future and into the welfare and well-being of our children and grandchildren. So we should really think about what do I need to live a decent life? What is well-being? What is quality of life? Is it just consumption of products? Of course it's not. There are so many things that make life meaningful. So I think what we should focus more on is well-being for all, and that of course also requires other indicators than GDP growth. to measure whether we are moving forward or not. GDP growth is a very simplistic concept or indicator. It does not tell you much about the well-being of a society. It tells you how much products are being produced, full stop. And some of them may be of high value, some of them may be of low value, some of them may lead to destruction of the environment and climate, and some of them may do the opposite. But we have no way in GDP statistics to distinguish between quantity and quality, and that is a big problem.
So in this context, what's your attitude to SDI, the newly introduced Sustainable Development Indicator, as an alternative to GDP?
Well, that was introduced already more than 20 years ago. But I think that whole discussion has been making a lot of progress. A friend of mine, a member of the Club of Rome, Bob Costanza, has done a lot of work on this. The same goes for Kate Ravert and Tim Jackson. So there are a number of individuals in different parts of the world who have devoted their lives to this. If you Google well-being and well-being indicators, you will find it.
All right, thanks so much, Mr. Wijkman. We are pleased to have you today, and thank you for this inspiring talk. To all the participants, we will send you some more replies to your questions, and we will send you the link to this video recording on the YouTube for those who probably missed the beginning. And we will send you also some links to our social media, because we would like you to follow us so that you get to know about the future webinars. And we are super thankful to all of you that you have granted your time to spend this hour with us. Thanks so much, and good luck in your own countries. Stay safe, take care, and all the best from Kiev to all of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.